Thanks so much for being with us today.
Great, and thank you, Jody. And before we dive into the content today, I also want to thank NPCA for their collaborative spirit to be able to host such an event like this, allowing us to be able to provide all the RPCVs and EPCVs on the call the opportunity to help provide some context to unpacking your Peace Corps service from a crisis management lens. My name is Mcmillan. I am the Graduate Programs Outreach Manager for SIT Graduate Institute. I work very closely with Jody and Dan, as well as Anne and Glenn at NPCA, helping to manage the partnership that we have with them, a partnership that we've had for about 10 years. The partnership allows us to provide opportunities like this for professional development opportunities for the RPCV community, as well as scholarships for RPCVs who may be interested in pursuing a graduate degree with SIT. So I'm thrilled to be here. I will be more in the background throughout this presentation. I'll be helping to manage the chat function throughout the presentation, as well as facilitate the Q&A at the end. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here today, and thank you for allowing us to join you and help you throughout this journey. So I will pass it over to my colleague, Joe Lanning, who will be the MC for today as he introduces the rest of the presentation. So thank you very much.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you're logging in from, everyone. My name is Joe Lanning. I'm also, as Megan said, so excited about this partnership and to continue to build what is a really long-standing relationship between the School for International Training and the National Peace Corps Association. Today we've got a lot of stuff to get through, and with a few of my really esteemed and talented colleagues, Bruce and Sora, who I'll have them introduce themselves. But just to tell you quick about me and sort of frame where we hope to go today. I am there we go. I'm an RPCV. I was a volunteer in Malawi in Southern Africa from 2000 to 2002. I was a health volunteer, and I was working primarily in HIV/AIDS education in a very rural community. This is, if you can see my background, this is my old Peace Corps site. I've been very, very lucky in the last 20 years to be able to go back to the community I worked in at least once a year. So I won't tell you the whole story, but it's been a really great third goal for me, and to continue my Peace Corps service in lots of different ways. But one of the ways that I've done it is as the program chair for one of our new global master's programs, which Sora will talk a lot about, the graduate work that's available at SIT later, but I'm the chair for a new program on development practice, and I'm also an undergraduate chair for an international honors program that looks at food systems in a comparative lens. We start in Georgia in the US, and then we head to Ecuador, and then we head to Malawi, and then we head to Italy, and we do comparative agriculture and food systems throughout the program. But all of this that I'm doing now really stems from my experience as a volunteer. So I'm really excited to have a chance to talk to you all today and share a little bit about my path, but start to talk about your path and how you got to being on this call with us today. Quick, I don't know if Sora and Bruce, if you want to unmute and just kind of introduce yourselves. I know you're going to each talk a lot more later, but just so folks know who else is here.
I'll go next. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Bruce Dayton. I'm the chair of two programs, professor chair of the Diplomacy and International Relations program, which is one of our global MAs. We start in Washington, we go to Geneva, then South Africa. It's a year-long program. I also run the Peace and Justice Leadership. That's a low residency hybrid master's degree. So it's for people who want to continue to work as they're working on their degree. And my field's really mainly conflict management, peace building, and crisis management mainly from a leadership lens. So I'll be sharing some content about crisis management with you in a little bit. Thanks.
And good day, everybody. I'm Sora Friedman here. I'm calling in from West Virginia, about 70 miles west of Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to join you. I am the program chair of our international education degrees at the master's level at SIT, and also of our newly revised intercultural service leadership and management degree. International education is interesting because it's a very broad field and it involves education at all levels, starting from primary and basic education through tertiary education and adult learning as well. We look at both formal credit-bearing programs as well as non-formal education programs. Many of those resonate with our Return Peace Corps volunteers or students who are then going into the Peace Corps as well. They're learning about community engagement with education, about the parental involvement in local education programs, youth leadership education, refugee resettlement education programs, language education, just as some examples. Our international service leadership and management degree is a hybrid program in which students are able to choose from all of the degrees that we offer in a low residency format and create their own course of study. So I'll also note that while I didn't serve as a Peace Corps volunteer, I did have the honor of working with Peace Corps in Guatemala and El Salvador about 20 years ago as the administrative liaison. World Learning, SIT's NGO sibling, if you will, was managing several Peace Corps programs in those countries at that time. And as part of my background in international education and non-formal education, I was helping to run the training programs specifically and spent a good bit of time at the training centers in those places. I'll talk a little bit more about SIT's long and treasured history with Peace Corps when I return towards the end of the session. I'll turn things back to you, Megan. So thank you. It's nice to be with everybody.
Megan, I'll take it. You want to pass it back over? So we've got some several objectives today, and we've got an agenda we'd like to sort of share out and tell you where this is going to go. I'll give you a little more introduction in a second. Then we're going to have a short breakout session, so you all can meet in some smaller groups and get to know some of the other RPCVs and EPCVs who might be on the call, and just kind of talk a little bit about who you are and your trajectory. Then Bruce is going to lead us through a conversation about what are crises and why are they so hard to deal with, and what does good crisis management look like. The objective here is to really unpack the experience that you all have just had, for those who've been evacuated, and for those who may have ended their service earlier and another time, and you're on the call to learn. It's totally applicable to you as well. But talking a little bit about how the world, how the Peace Corps, how we as individuals are working our way through this current global crisis in relation to COVID-19 and evacuations from programs, and also for those who were already in the U.S. or those racial justice. So there's a lot going on in the world right now. So we're going to talk about what crisis management looks like. Then we're going to have another little short breakout session where you're going to go back with your group that you saw previously and address a few discussion questions and try to think about this next stage of, where can I go from here? And Sora's going to pop back in here and talk to us about that, sort of based on where we were, how we think through the crisis, how do we move forward, and how do we realize what our story can be, and think about the careers and graduate school options that are ahead, and also address the long relationship between Peace Corps and the School for International Training. I want to start, jumping back up to the introduction here, thinking about how we rewrite the narrative of our experience with this crisis. So there's many stories to be told and many lessons that you've already learned and are still learning by processing how you and your host communities have managed this crisis. Hopefully folks have found ways to stay in touch with host communities if you were evacuated, but there's a lot of stories already being told. I've talked to several evacuated volunteers one-on-one already, and I'm starting to hear how people are processing this experience, and how their stories are even changing a little bit through time as they start to think about how this experience has affected them and their host community. So we're going to talk about that. You might have had a story that you kind of expected to tell when you unpacked your Peace Corps, suitcase, your Peace Corps experience.
Joe, you're cutting out a little bit.
Oh,
just
sorry.
FYI, you're cutting out a little bit. It's just been
Okay.
twice, but just one thing that you might need to do is turn off your video at one point. It can help.
I'll do that. Can you hear me now? Bruce, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me? All right, thanks. So just taking a step back, you may have had a story that you expected to tell from your time as a Peace Corps volunteer, and now you're potentially telling a very different one, a very new one, that can have lots of different framings. And I think one of our goals for today is to really suggest to you that it doesn't have to be one that's framed only talking about the crisis itself, but talking about how you developed new and unexpected tools to address your future by how you worked your way through this crisis and how your host communities have worked through this crisis. So, thinking about your experience as a Peace Corps volunteer and, potentially an evacuated Peace Corps volunteer in a time of crisis, really, we think necessitates some reflexivity. It requires you to really, address your values and your feelings and the concerns you had both going into Peace Corps originally, because those framed what you thought your experience was going to be, and then being reflexive and looking at where you are now. And learning, that type of learning and that type of reflexivity, especially through a crisis, is really an iterative process. You've done the process, you accumulate new skills and new learning and new ways of looking at what's just happened to you in your community. A lot of the greatest insights are going to emerge unexpectedly. They're a response to unplanned encounters, moments that challenge our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with other people. And this is one of those moments. And revisiting this experience with this crisis is really critical. We hope that today you can figure out a little bit about what you've already learned and try to articulate that as Bruce leads you through a conversation about crises. And then think about, what do I still have to learn? And Sora will help guide you through that conversation. And, potentially SIT is a place where that happens, but there's lots of places where you can, continue to develop what you've already learned through going through this crisis. So just with that little framing, again, I'm so happy to be here. I'm happy to, share I know our contact information is shared at the end, and if anybody wants to reach out and chat more one-on-one or anything, I'm available anytime, and really happy to be talking to a group of PCVs. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Bruce. And as we said, Bruce is going to lead us through a conversation about what a crisis is and why it's so hard to deal with. So Bruce, to you.
Actually, are we doing this breakout session first, Joe?
Yes, we are. I always jump ahead a slide. So the first thing we're going to do before we jump to Bruce is get to know each other a little bit. We're going to have this quick breakout session. You're going to be sent to a room with 4 or 5 other folks who are on the call. And we want you to address a few things. First, share your name, a little bit about who you are, where and when you served, your sector of service. As I said, I was a health volunteer. And then we want you to think about this prompt and talk about it with the other members in your group. We want you to think about a time during your service when you felt your values and norms were challenged, and what you were doing to address this challenge. And now that you're back, do you have a different perspective on the situation and how you might work through the challenge differently? So I'm going to suggest that if you have your phone or something, just take a quick screenshot of this slide, because you won't see it in your breakout group. Just so you can remember what these prompts are. You can screenshot the whole thing, whatever. And we're going to send you these breakout groups, and then you'll get a little message that invites you back to the conversation in about 10 minutes. Sound good?
I think people should all have received their invitation, and just heads up to the co-hosts here. It does look like in one breakout room, there's Bruce, Joe, and Sora. So you all are together, and then Megan is in another one with, and that's fine. There's 3 people without you, so they should be fine.
Looks like we've got Aaron. I don't know if you can hear us. Aaron might not have been
Let me
sent to a
see.
breakout room.
Says not joined. I'm going to move him into one right now. Oh, there's actually a couple. Let me get them added. Move to 2. Okay, great. He hasn't joined. Okay, that's fine. All right. Oh, there's somebody. I'm going to move. There's somebody down here. Let's see. So we're okay. We have 2 to 3 in one. Yeah, 2 to 3 in each one. That's nice and small. All right. And I think it's just us now here. Oh, Aaron is still showing. Yeah. He's been invited. We'll see. Aaron, if you can hear me, you've been invited to one of the breakout groups. If you, I think, just click on the button, you should be fine. And ping me in the chat room if you're having difficulty. Thanks. And let's see. So at 11, maybe 11:26, I will go ahead and put a message in, just saying, I'll do a 2-minute warning just so they have maybe more time to wrap up, and that should be fine. And Joe, with my comment on the camera, so I've just found sometimes for me, I've had to do that, but I much prefer, like, it's so nice to see you with that beautiful background. So I would probably say when they get back, try it again. If it continues to happen, and it's really for, like, what would you say, folks? Are you hearing the cutout? It's like 5 to maybe 10 seconds max, but it's enough that you miss a sentence, so that's why I came in, but I would try it again with your, with your screen, just because it's so nice to hear and see and, all of that. But just wanted to give you a heads up. I'll let you know if it does happen again.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
It's so weird. Some programs it never happens. Other programs it happens all the time. Who knows?
And isn't it day to day too? I mean, I do a lot of, these, and some days the internet, it seems like it's really cooperative, and then, other days it's just not, or it breaks up a lot, and
I've been using up all my data the last month with all these calls, and
right.
they click the governor in, and it starts slowing down everything for me. So
exactly. Oh my goodness. So, well, I'm glad we are recording this as well, and we'll, if it's okay with you, we'll be featuring it on our website. We have it's a playlist for the Global Reentry Program that's part of the NPCA's channel on YouTube. So we'll probably put it on there if that's okay. And that way, if folks missed it, we definitely, and we may still have some other ones that are coming on, how that goes, kind of goes up and down, but we had over 50 that registered for it. So we will hopefully have some more coming on, but we'll definitely share it, and I'm sure they'll see it as well. I know I had 4 different Zoom webinar things yesterday alone. It's like, you talk about Zoom fatigue. We get it too.
I'm just going to note that when we come back together, I'm going to not just mute myself, but take myself off video, but I'm here. I'm listening, I just want everybody to know I'm here, but just to cut down the bandwidth and the distraction. So
that's a good idea, actually. Yeah, as people in the background, we could, I'm sure that helps too. All right, let's see, 11:21. This is such a great topic for people, and especially, the evacuated folks, but anyone really, when you're coming back and thinking about your service and moving forward. So
they may have reached the point where people say, oh, how was it? And then after a second say, oh, that's great. Did I tell you about what happened to me? So the chance to talk with other people who get it, hopefully, is a valued one.
Exactly. I mean, because that's the biggest thing that I used to, and still talking about when you come back, it's that glazed eye look, I call it, where, you are so excited, you're back, whatever, and you start to tell them, and, you've reached like the third sentence, and whoever it is, your friend, family member, whatever, they're just glazed eye look. And it's like, okay, let's order, I mean, and that's such a shutdown for you. And it's so hard. So yeah, I think you're right. I think they really value the opportunity to talk with somebody else who gets it. And with you, Joe, who gets it, like you said, you know what I mean? You've been through it and you teach this now, which is great. Yeah, absolutely. Has SIT determined, I forget if we asked when we were doing our prep, I don't think so. Has SIT determined what's happening in the fall in terms of online versus in-person versus combo?
For some programs, yes, and for some programs, no.
Okay.
Most of our undergraduate programs are either shifting to online offerings of different models, mostly because a lot of the colleges that send their students on our programs are not allowing students to travel.
Oh, and yours is all about, sure, that component. If it's
for our graduate programs, the decision is going to be made in the first week of July for our global master's programs. It's just too early for so many locations to know, trying to wait until the last possible moment and still give our students enough time to get ready. Exactly. And our online programs started 2 weeks ago, so they are well underway.
Yeah. It's an interesting time. I know in talking, to folks from some of the other colleges as well, it's, the amount. Oh, hi. We have somebody else who has just joined. Sarintra, is that right? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah. Hi, you are coming in. That's great. We're going to be actually, I'm going to assign you to a group just so you can listen in, but it's going to be just a couple minutes. They're doing a breakout session on the topic that's right here, just so you know a little bit about, what they're talking about. I'll go ahead and put you in one, and then, and then you just know that we'll be coming out fairly quickly. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Seems like we might have enough small enough group that there's space for some good conversation at the end.
Yeah.
I hope that we can have a good Q&A session. Let people unmute and actually be active learners. Bruce, do you feel adequately framed?
I'm framed up, Joe. Thanks.
Great.
We can frame you more if you like. Bruce did it.
You could do my whole presentation. That would be an adequate frame right there.
I'm just putting the message in. I went into that room to introduce her really quickly, and then I'm just doing the message right now.
Great.
Jody is a Zoom expert. It's very impressive.
Hardly.
So, Joe, do you want me to just jump in, or were you going to say something to wrap up that breakout?
You could just jump in.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, and I will disappear myself.
Perfect. I'll do the same.
All right, they should be coming back momentarily in about, what, 30 or 40 seconds. It'll automatically bring them back. Some will come back sooner, probably. All right, I think most people are coming back now, so take it away.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you got a sense of each other and experiences, and we'll be doing another little breakout after I provide some content. But for now, we want to transition to this topic of crisis management. And to me, how can you not be interested in crisis and crisis management? It's a topic that is very close to all of us right now. It feels like the country and the world is being convulsed by a crisis. So we thought this might be an interesting thing to present and talk a little bit about. My own background in this field of crisis management is I've been part of a consortium of universities for the past about 12 years in Europe and the United States that have been collecting case studies on crisis management. We have well over 200 cases now, and we're actually interested in seeing what it's like to be a person or a leader or a decision maker who has to walk through a crisis, and what makes crisis management so hard when you're going through one, and what seems to work and doesn't work in terms of crisis management, particularly in different contexts. Crises have things that are similar, but all crises are a little bit unique. So all of my comments are based on this research project I've been part of, and I'll be drawing on some cases as I make some points. And I'm going to work through pretty rapidly. I'm going to I teach a semester-long course on crisis management. I'm going to condense that into about 20 minutes or maybe a little bit more. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so next slide. So a good starting point, a good colleague of mine at Leiden University came up with this term crisis world for a website that he was creating. Really gets at this sense that a lot of us have now, that the world just seems to be in crisis so much. And there's been a tremendous growth and interest in crisis management over the past 25 years. I'm often asked to give talks on crisis management. There's a lot of engagement. And the question is why? Why this tremendous growth? You could say human history is the history of crisis. So what is it about today that makes crisis so unique and such an urgent sense among many of us that we have to get better at knowing what they are and how to deal with them? Well, you can answer that in a few ways. The literature on crisis management, one of the starting points is that they're actually getting more severe and more numerous. And again, that's kind of strange. Why would crises today be more numerous and severe? Because isn't the history of humans a history of crisis? Well, the argument here is that as we modernize, as we create complex systems that are interdependent, as we globalize, there's more and more potential for crisis as we rely on these interconnected systems. Because unlike the old days, if you had just a crisis in one sector, it would stay in that sector. And today we're creating systems where a crisis in one sector has a cascading effect, almost like a contagion effect. You can imagine throwing a stone in a pond and seeing the ripples go outward. We're so interconnected that when one segment fails, it causes failures in other segments. You can look at coronavirus as just a great example of that. No longer contained to a market in China. In a matter of weeks, a virus had spread around the world. One of the cases in our case bank is over a famous blackout in the Northeast United States in the early 2000s that was caused by the failure of one transformer on one telephone line in Walton Hills, Ohio, that had a cascading effect and brought a blackout to the entire Northeast United States within a matter of hours. You could think of the 2008 financial crisis. You could think about the so-called Arab Spring, right? All of these big crises from our recent past. One notable thing about them is that they spread around the world. Crises aren't contained anymore. So I think that's one one reason why people are so interested in crises. Another is that poor crisis management is often correlated with unrest and change. So a lot of leaders and governments are really interested in getting better at crisis management, because if you blow it, if you look for periods of change in systems and politics, they're usually often preceded by crises, and two big crises we're facing right now in terms of the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder and coronavirus. Really, the question is, how is this going to change and transform our system? And if citizens lose faith in their government through a crisis, it can really bring about some dramatic changes. They also make or break political careers. I always think about, my favorite example is Rudy Giuliani, who you probably all know now, but before 9/11, of course, he was the mayor of New York City right before 9/11. And right before then, his career was over. His police department was in scandal. He was in a private scandal. He had an affair on his wife, and it was in the tabloids. Nobody thought we'd ever hear from Rudy Giuliani again. Then came 9/11 and the pictures of Rudy Giuliani in command, going through the streets. It resuscitated his career. And of course, the opposite is true. We can think of leaders who really blew it during times of crisis. So if you're going to be a leader, you need to know something about good crisis management. Finally, it's a great career opportunity. So for people who are interested in going into the field, there's a lot of resources now. There's a lot of work in the field. Okay. Next slide. Just real briefly, so what do I mean when I say crises? Well, in our 200 plus cases in our case bank, we break them down. So think about crises as coming in all shapes and sizes. We have natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, droughts, health pandemics like coronavirus, SARS, political instability, war, unrest, financial breakdown, technological failure, maybe the failure of critical infrastructure. It's got a picture of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a number of years ago, which was triggered by the explosion on that platform. Environmental disaster and political scandal. So really, as we think about this topic, think about all the different shapes that crises come in. Next slide. All right, so what is a crisis? We better define what we mean by a crisis. So I want you to think about crises that you were involved in, maybe in country, in your host communities. My guess is there were many of different types of crises that in some ways you had to deal with. Crises in your communities at home, things that are happening to you now. So yes, all crises are unique, but all crises also have a number of, well, actually have three things in common. And those of us who study crises, we typically say for it to be a crisis, and in our cases, for us to accept a case in the case bank, a crisis has to involve three things. So the first, and the next slide, is a high threat. So one thing that characterizes crises is different from the day-to-day management of problems that you have to do in your workplace or when you were in service. One thing that differentiates it is crises are high threat situations, and they present a high threat usually to core values. And that is different for decision makers who are navigating crises, because normally people aren't paying attention to what we're doing. We just do our jobs. We go about working in our committees and doing our day-to-day routines. But in crises, it's different because values are so threatened, and values that everyone cares about, that the stakes of succeeding or failing are higher. There's huge public attention to what's going on, so that's even more pressure. So that increases a real urgency on the part of decision makers to do something. And when I say values, one interesting thing about the cases we study, next slide, is that most crises are really difficult to manage because multiple values are at stake at the same time, and often they're very contradictory, right? So classically, you can think of COVID-19. What makes management of COVID-19 so difficult? And let's just take in the United States for a moment. Well, one thing is you have fundamental values of economic security and fundamental values of human health and protection that themselves seem to be in a zero-sum struggle. So two core values that are competing at the same time. It makes managing and deciding what to do extremely difficult. Got another picture here of the protests in front of the White House, the protests which have been sweeping the nation really on the future of policing and on racial injustice in the United States. And you can think about what are the conflicting values there that may explain why it seems so hard for our leaders to come up with a decision of what to do. Well, you've got stability and order, you have the value of due process, you have the value of human life, you have the value of justice, the value of national reputation and identity. So all of these values are intersecting at the same time that make a really difficult stew for leaders to figure out what to do. Next slide. Okay, so that's the first trait of crises. All of them involve high threat. The second is you have to couple that with urgency. So unlike the day-to-day things we do when we go to work, where we have a lot of time to make decisions and figure things out, crises always involve a sense of urgency, a finite time which decision makers are able to respond, a window of opportunity to act. Let me give you one example. How long do people survive in a building after an earthquake if they're trapped without water before they die? Do you know? 3 days. And that's why after a big earthquake, after 3 days, there's this tragic moment that we move from a search and rescue operations to a recovery, knocking down the buildings and clearing the debris. And that's because responders know that they have 3 days to save everyone who may be left alive in those buildings. And after those 3 days, you can bet that everybody in those buildings has now died through dehydration. That's urgency. So how does urgency affect us when we're dealing with a crisis? One thing that we see in cases is what's called contraction of authority, which is people who in normal times low down the decision-making chain may have control over the decisions that are made in whatever they're overseeing. Often in a crisis, contraction of authority means people higher up on the chain of command suddenly get in charge, suddenly become in charge. You saw this with coronavirus, which immediately we had this contraction of authority, and we saw President Trump and his team and his news conferences every day. It moved from a local to a state to a national level through the contraction of authority. Another impact of urgency that we see in cases is often because you have to act so quickly, 3 days for the earthquake, we make a lot of mistakes. There's unintended consequences because we can't think through all the contingencies. We're in a rush to act. And so we see a lot of mistakes. Bad crisis management can be explained a lot of times by this urgency. One example from the cases that will show this in a really simple way is during the 9/11 crisis in the United States in New York City. We have several cases on that. Firefighters went into the Twin Towers to save people the way they normally would approach fighting a fire in a high-rise. You go into the building, you go up through the stairways, and you save people. But because of the rush, the urgency, they didn't consider the fact that that standard operating procedure doesn't work when a jet crashes into a steel-framed building, because jet fuel burns at such a higher temperature than normal combustibles in a high-rise building that it actually had the capacity to melt the steel structure that was holding up the towers, and they collapsed. Urgency leading to a tragic oversight. Next slide. And the other thing that I'm sure all of you have felt if you've had to manage a crisis, and is if you were just evacuated, what you felt like being evacuated, watching people around you in your host community who are dealing with COVID-19, or maybe part of the unrest that's happening in your cities now. Urgency also causes a deterioration in performance. So any social psychologists who are listening out there, you may be familiar with this stress performance curve, and it turns out that a little bit of stress is really good for performance, and good managers know how to stress their employees a little bit if they're not stressed. If I wasn't stressed presenting to you today, I'd probably be very monotone. It wouldn't be interesting. So stress is good, right? Stress helps us perform, but there's an optimal level of stress after which performance really quickly falls off. And when we study crises, that's what we see: decision makers and leaders and people who are really embroiled in crises, rapid deterioration of performance because the stress, you think about it, up for days, all the pressure and attention, deterioration of performance. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that there's these three components of that all crises have in similar. The final is uncertainty. So an incomplete understanding of the origin of the risks of the crisis, an uncertain understanding of the impact that our actions are going to have on making things better or worse. Hopefully you're thinking of COVID right now. Again, thinking, how did COVID-19, where's the uncertainty? Wow. It continues to be an information poor environment. We don't know really where COVID, how it's going to develop. We're only beginning to learn now, but certainly at the outset of crises, we have a very incomplete understanding of what's going on and why. And that understanding, that uncertainty, one of the things that we see happening in crisis situations is, because there's so much uncertainty, different stakeholders can frame and define what's happening and why in very different ways. So let's go back to COVID, and we can see that. You can say, well, I know the analogy to COVID-19, it's just like the flu. And we've heard some commentators say, oh, use the analogy to frame COVID, it's like the flu. And if it's like the flu, well, we know how we fight the flu, and so we have to fight it in this way. Others, like Anthony Fauci, framed it in other ways, a novel, highly dangerous virus that is unlike anything we saw. Other people have framed it as like Ebola. Other people have said, well, it'll go away in warm weather. Other people have said, well, the models show that it'll kill 25,000, and then others say 60, and now it's up to 200,000. When you are making decisions in an uncertain environment, there's room for vastly different descriptions of what's going on and why. And the term of art we use when we study this is that leads to what's called path dependency, because how we define a crisis at the outset determines the path we walk down to manage it. Define it in one way and we go down one path. Define it in another way, we go down another path. And so we often look in crises as who's framing these things and how did that frame lead to a particular way of doing things. Next slide. And here's a really simple example of the significance of path dependency and uncertainty. Probably many of you have seen this picture before. It's one of those trick pictures. But if you haven't seen it before, what's the first thing? What is this a picture of? What is this an image of? We know from showing this to a lot of people that some people immediately see a rabbit and some people see a duck, right? Rabbits have 4 legs, ducks have 2. So it's a trick. How you look at it depends what you see. And what you see determines how you might approach that animal. And so this is just the point of crisis management and why for those of us embroiled in crisis, it's so hard to figure out what's going on. And we make that big leap to say, I see a rabbit, figuratively speaking, or I see a duck, and that will determine the way we go. I remember that on the outset of after 9/11, George Bush first uttered the phrase, we're going to have a war on terrorism. This is a war. Think about the power that that framing had on determining everything that came afterwards. You define that crisis as a war, the attack on America as something that combatants did. Your response is going to be totally different than if you defined it as a criminal act. Same too with COVID. Same too with the unrest across the country. What is it about? How do we frame and understand what's happening in America now? How we frame it is going to determine what we do. Politics, it's said, is a battle among naming, framing, and blaming. A battle between naming, framing, and blaming. And that's what crises do. We battle it out, and we're battling it out on coronavirus right now. Okay, next slide. Okay, yep, so if you put them together, here's the definition of crises that I use by my colleague Ariane Boyne. A crisis is a situation presenting a basic threat to the fundamental values and norms of a system, which under time pressure and highly uncertain circumstances necessitates making a vital decision. Next slide. And here's what that looks like. So Charles Herman in 1969, who was one of the founders of the field of studying crises, came up with this crisis cube. And I think of it as the perfect storm for leaders and decision makers in a bad way. A perfect storm meaning there's no more difficult circumstances to try to lead and decide what to do than when the threat is high, when the time to decide is short, and when you have no idea what's going on because you have such great uncertainty. So we're going to do the second breakout now. Next slide. Yep, here it is. And we're going to break you into small groups again. And I just want you to play with these three dimensions of crises. Remember them in your head. As Joe said, for the first breakout, if you want to take a picture with your phone of this slide, go ahead and do it. You'll be in a breakout for about 15 minutes. And I want you each to share an experience you had of a crisis. Maybe it happened during your Peace Corps experience, or maybe it's something that's happening now. But play around with this notion of what were the multiple values at stake and how did different values cause challenges in managing the crisis? To what degree was the event a surprise, and what were the main elements of uncertainty that made it hard to figure out what to do and how to respond? And last, how much time was there to respond, and how did that window of opportunity, the short window of opportunity, make acting difficult? So think of an example, share your example, then talk a little bit about these things. You'll be placed into a breakout room now, and then just like before, when the 15 minutes is about up, you'll be prompted and you'll come back into the room, and then we'll wrap up this session and go to the next one. So go ahead and join your breakouts.
And just a note, we do have you in the same breakouts more or less. So I think you just need to rejoin. You need to click on that again to say that you're joining. Thank you. And facilitators, I put you all in one. So you're breakout room 3 and you're right here. Oh, I have one person that hasn't joined. Let me add her. Assign to. There we go. Great.
Okay, so we'll go till about 5 past, right?
Perfect.
And a few minutes before, I'll put the message out just saying 2 minutes to wrap up. I'll set an alarm here.
Okay. And how do you think we're doing on time? I know we have 2 hours, but I don't know what people's tolerance are. Do you think I've got 2 more slides to go through before we turn it over to Sora. You think we're on track?
Externally, like I'm not in the, you have more of an idea of what all is to come still, but I think it's very good content and I think most interesting. I think that I know as I'm listening to it, I'm like, wow, I want to go to SIT and get that.
Oh, good. You're drinking the juice.
I guess I am.
Bruce, I think we're doing really well on time, and I think we'll have time for those who are still around to have a little discussion. Are you hoping to have, I mean, since it's such a small group, are you going to have them share back from this session or from this breakout?
If anyone wants to, you mean? Like just share their thoughts?
Can they do it orally, or are they only allowed to
With
do that
this-
in the chat function now?
No, with this size of a group, we could certainly have them unmute themselves. You know, I have it right now where they're all automatically, I think, muted when they come in, or generally we do that, but they could unmute themselves. When we have a big group, it's hard to do that because you have people talking over each other and it just doesn't work. But in a small, intimate group, I think it's absolutely fine to just say, if somebody wants to share something you were talking about, feel free to unmute yourself. Just tell them to do so.
Okay, so I won't let that go too much because it could be a disaster, but maybe no more than 5 minutes. If people want to do things, it's just as likely there'll be silence. So I'll let an uncomfortable silence go for a minute, but then I'm going to jump back in if nobody digs in.
What do they say? You have to, whenever you ask a question, you're supposed to wait at least, it's like this 10 seconds of just total silence. And that's so uncomfortable for people who are participating,
right?
That then somebody usually speaks up.
It's excruciating. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if we need a whole minute.
I feel like I find though that this group, particularly maybe of Peace Corps volunteers, might handle that well. I know that was like, if we talk about lessons learned as a volunteer, I think that was the biggest lesson I learned in 2 years was that, you know, a long pause is an uncomfortable thing for me as someone from the US, but it's not necessarily uncomfortable to anybody else around the world.
Good point.
Since we do have 15 minutes, I'm going to go refill my coffee cup real quick.
I am going to go get some water real quick. I shall return.
Yep, I'll return too. Good idea.
I'll hang out with you, Meg.
Sounds good. I might get up and get more coffee in a second here, but I'm 10 feet from my kitchen, so that's okay.
I wonder if facilitator conversations are part of the recording or not.
The breakout. Oh, yeah, I'm not sure on that one. Very good point.
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I would guess perhaps not, that it might, you know, frame it right at the, I don't know though. I'll do a little research on that behind the scenes here.
Those birds in your background, Sora?
You can hear them.
They're beautiful. Oh my gosh.
It's amazing how many there are. It's you know, there are 10 houses in my little neighborhood.
Yeah.
There's just a ring of woods. It's not huge. I mean, we can walk to the next neighborhood, but we have a ton of birds. It's and
sounds very peaceful right now. Just that must be a perfect spot for doing work.
It is. It is very quiet because it's a court and we don't get a lot of traffic. I have to admit, just as Bruce was wrapping up, there was a knock on the door. A friend of ours dropped off a loaf of homemade bread. That's why I quickly stuck a piece in my mouth because it's
still warm.
So good. So I made a pot of chicken soup last night for dinner. So for lunch, I just decided I'm having chicken soup and a huge piece of bread and butter.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, it's raining here today, so I think soup is on the agenda for dinner. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, there's a cardinal that always at 9 a.m. and then at noon, it always comes and lands right on my fence, which I can see right outside my window here. And it just, that the cardinal sound is so distinct that I can, my windows are shut right now just because it's raining, but yeah, it's just beautiful.
We have cardinals, blue jays, robins, finches, doves. We've been getting more and more. We do have crows, not so many that they're disruptive, just, and I actually like the sound of crows. I always have. And then of course a bunch that I have no clue what they are.
Yeah, we have a lot of wrens around here. My neighbor has a wren house that gets a lot of them, and blue jays and cardinals.
Talking about birds.
Yeah, I've gotten into birding recently.
Megan, you know I have 2 parrots, right?
No, I don't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's who I was just playing with in the other room for a minute.
Okay, we're gonna have to have a separate call so I can meet these parrots.
What are their names, Joe?
Barbarella and Pippin.
Ah.
And Pippin is a 26-year-old cockatiel, and
Wow.
Barb is an 8-year-old Jardines parrot.
Wow.
When I was in like high school and I was babysitting, I think my most interesting babysitting job was actually babysitting for a bird. This couple was going out and they never left their bird alone. It was about 25 years old and a huge, gorgeous.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, welcome back. So I hope that was an interesting conversation and a chance for you to apply some of these ideas about crisis management to your own experiences. Let me just, for a minute or two, open it up, and Jody is going to give you the capacity to speak by unmuting anybody who wants to talk. So if there's something you would like to share about an insight you had through your conversation, not necessarily repeating what you said, but something you learned by talking to your fellow volunteers. You're unmuted now, so if somebody wants to jump in, feel free to do that.
Actually, you can unmute yourself now, just so you know. If you want to speak, just unmute yourself, and I know Bruce and everyone would love to hear what you have to say.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Paige. I think one of the main things, just talking about the different crisis situations, is just the timeliness of it, which is one thing that we had mentioned earlier, but just how quick, like even a couple of days. Our group was talking a lot about the evacuation specifically with COVID-19 and how, like, man, if our country had waited like 2 more days or something to have evacuated us, even transportation would have looked so different, and getting us out of the Capitol would have been so much more difficult and things like that. So it really speaks to how timely in crisis situations people in authority have to act, and just being very aware of that.
Yeah, that interplay between short time and high threat. We saw that playing out everywhere in decision-making, people waiting, not waiting. So excellent comment, thanks. Anybody else like to share? All
If
right.
anything, Peace Corps makes us more comfortable with silence, right? So if anyone does want to say anything, this is your chance.
Hi, so my name is Surintra. I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand. So we were the first country outside of China who had a case of the coronavirus. And we were notified of it through the HQ, through the country director, to be careful and things like that. So, and as time went on, the country director did tell us that we would not be evacuated, or it's an unlikely chance that we would be, because of we are the hub for people for medical. And so for this event, it was much of a surprise, even though we were the first ones to have it. And there was a lot of uncertainty on when we would leave and things like that. Like we were told we would leave in 2 weeks, and then we were told we were leaving in 1 week, and then as soon as possible you could leave. And as Paige was saying, that if we did wait a few more days, we cannot leave. So that was a really big problem as well for us.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi, my name is Crystal, and I served in Peace Corps, Ukraine. And just to add to what you were saying, Ukraine, we found out about the different countries that were having the coronavirus, and we found out about which countries were being evacuated, but it was unlikely that we would be. So the day that they said, okay, guys, just stay at home, they said that to us in the morning, and then by the evening, they're like, okay, guys, you need to leave now. And we're just like, oh, shoot, one day. So in one day, we actually had to leave. But unlike the other two, we did have issues with transportation. So we actually spent almost a week just waiting for a plane, because all our planes kept getting canceled. But the good thing about our experience is that we actually had a hotel to stay at, and though all the volunteers were pretty much depressed, we kind of helped lift each other's spirit during that time. So I think that was the best part of the evacuation, that we had each other.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's making me think about the importance of standard operating procedures. They're nice if you have them, right? Militaries succeed because nobody is making decisions on the battlefield, because there's a standard operating procedure for everything. You don't have to think, you just follow the procedure. But one of the things about crises that makes them really difficult is particularly when they're surprises and nobody sees them coming, because there are no standard operating procedures. So maybe there was something on evacuation, but probably not this scale. And so many things not thought of in terms of how to deploy resources to make the evacuation possible. So really looking at standard operating procedures can be an interesting window into why things succeed or fail. Those are great. So it sounds like you had some interesting conversations. I just have a couple more slides. So next slide. And this is related to some of the things you were just talking about, and I think you shared in the breakouts. So far, we've been talking about what a crisis is and why they're hard. And the good news is there is a field called crisis management. And it's this field that's been growing. It's a interdisciplinary field, a little bit of political science, a little bit of public administration, a little sociology, you name it. So what does good crisis management look like? Next slide. So think about if this is a field you might go into, and I was just thinking of, there's this organization, Team Rubicon, and it is made up of former veterans who volunteer. It's a huge organization now. They volunteer in times of crisis, in natural disasters and pandemics. And they were founded about 10 years ago, and now they are all over the place. And the argument is that veterans, because of their service in the military, are uniquely qualified to do good crisis management. And so you have this internal source of these really smart, capable people able to do things in a crisis, who make sense to create this Team Rubicon. Peace Corps is a little bit like that too. I think you've developed skills, and certainly intercultural competency skills and problem solving skills, that may make you uniquely suited for a field related to crisis management or dealing with humanitarian emergencies or other kinds of natural disasters or any crises. So the definition of crisis management as a field, it's a set of decisions made and actions taken to assess, mitigate, prepare for, respond to, recover from, and learn from crisis events. So if you remember nothing else from this session, I hope you remember that good crisis management is something that starts a long, long time before the crisis begins and only ends a long, long time after the crisis is over. And here's what that looks like visually. Next slide. So this is sometimes called the disaster management cycle. I'm calling it the crisis management cycle here. And here's this visual of the fact that if you want to be good at crisis management, or if you want to look at your organization, whether it's the Peace Corps or an organization you may be working for now, you can judge how well that organization can manage crises by looking at what it has done in each of these related sequential activities. And we really start with the top. And this is where good crisis management begins a long, long time before the crisis breaks out. And that's because we have to know what it is we should be afraid of. We have limited resources, whether you're a school or an organization like the Peace Corps, or the federal government, or the state of New York, or a small nonprofit organization. You have limited resources, and we live in this world of crises. So how do we decide what are the things we really should be afraid of and put some resources into making sure we're ready for them if they happen, or prevent them from happening? So there's this huge field called risk assessment and risk management. And it involves a lot of interesting approaches. The dominant approach in the field of risk assessment is if you can figure out, if you can you can rank order all the risks being faced by your organization. If you can come up with a value for every contingency, bad contingency you imagine, how likely it is to occur. And if it occurs, how costly will it be? And I mean costly in a broad sense, not just money, but costly to human psychology, costly to values. And part of the game in risk assessment is putting a value to each of those things. And risk, if you look at the Department of Homeland Security, how they calculate it, it is a function of likelihood times cost. That's it. Likelihood times cost. If you can come up with a value for each of those things, you get an overall risk value. And then all you do is rank order them from highest value to lowest. And that, as an organization, gives you a sense of, okay, what are the things we need to look out for to address? But if you were in my semester-long class, I'd also talk to you about how difficult that is, because bias creeps in to what we see. And there's so many examples of things that happen all the time that we're not afraid of for some reason, and things that almost never happen that we're really afraid of. It turns out that human beings are really bad at risk assessment because of the blinders we have. I use my poor brother-in-law as an example of this, where he's one of those people who doesn't believe in vaccinating his children from the big diseases, because he sees risk in that. He believes the conspiracy theories about vaccination. So he amplifies that risk and he won't vaccinate his children. At the same time, he has a trampoline in his backyard for his children, and it has no net around it. And we know from data that one of the biggest causes of childhood injuries is kids jumping on trampolines and falling off. So the question is, why is it that we amplify, in his case, vaccination risks and de-amplify trampoline risks? And it turns out we do this all the time. There's a lot of really interesting literature from sociology on that we can look at. I'm also fascinated all the time. Every year, the CIA and the other intelligence agencies go before Congress and they do what's called a national intelligence estimate, which is they tell members of Congress, here's the biggest risks facing the United States. Can you imagine how they come up with that? How do you do that in a way that takes politics out of the process, reduces blinders, is based on good data? Really hard. So that's the first stage. So when we train crisis managers, the first thing we're doing is training them to know how to assess risks. The second stage is, once you know what you should be afraid of, or the most things you should be most afraid of, how do you mitigate that? How do you make it impossible for those things to happen? Or if they do, really reduce the likelihood that they will have any damaging consequences? That's the mitigation phase. So think about these two phases in terms of COVID. Did we assess the risks? And that's an interesting question, because you talk to some people or you hear some experts and they say, oh, we knew this was coming all along, but something was missed. This was not in the consciousness. There was no standard operating procedure. So we missed something in risk assessment. We missed something in mitigation. How did we do with COVID in preparedness, which is the next phase of crisis management? So the preparedness, what we look at there is if you somehow fail to mitigate the risk, or it's such a surprise you never could have prevented it, what does preparedness look like, and how do we do good preparedness? So there's all sorts of decisions that go into preparedness, how to stage equipment, how to communicate. There's this popular idea in risk preparedness now in social capital, meaning that part of preparedness is having good relations with people in your organization, because if the first time you have to deal with somebody is in a crisis, it's not going to go really well. So there's a push now in crisis management to develop social relations between people who are parts of teams. So in a crisis, they can perform more effectively. Simulations, that's a huge part of crisis management. I was in the Federal Emergency Management Agency a few years ago, and they almost every day are involved in a simulated crisis. And it's not real, right? It's an imaginary desktop exercise, but the idea is it's a form of preparedness. So let's look at COVID, and we can run that through the lens of what kinds of things were done to prepare our country or the organization you're working for, the state, for this outbreak. And I think we can be pretty critical there. Next phase is response, right? Who does what? How do people communicate? How do we message the public? Is there a plan for messaging the public in times of crises? Was the standard operating procedure followed? Did it work? Did it fit the circumstances? So we look at each of these events and we look at this response phase. The last two phases are after the crisis is over. The first is a really interesting phase called the recovery stage. And when we research the recovery stage, what we're looking at is what is done to bring back a sense of normality, make people feel comfortable and safe again. And I didn't have time to put up the graphic, but one graphic I use here points out that there's two different kinds of ways to terminate a crisis. One is operational termination, and that's when you don't need equipment anymore, the hospitals aren't full anymore. Operationally, the problem is over, it's gone. We have a vaccine. The more interesting is called political closure. And political closure is the sense among your constituencies and people that we understand what went wrong and why, that's been fixed, and we feel safe. And often you have a crisis that operationally is over for a long time, but we haven't yet achieved that sense of political closure, that sense that something's wrong. And sometimes that requires public rituals. Sometimes that requires hearings to assign in culpability and bring justice if things were missed. So there's a lot to look at in the recovery stage, and a lot of things that have illustrated how to do recovery, good and bad. Then the final stage is probably the hardest, learning. How many crises happen over and over again in this country, around the world, because we simply fail to learn. And learning is really hard because you have to collect data while the crisis is ongoing in order to analyze it later and figure out what went well and what went wrong. There's often a political reason not to do learning, because learning can come with who did what wrong, and most organizations are not interested in looking at who did the wrong things, so they don't want to learn bad messages, particularly public agencies. And then we think about learning in terms of kind of 3 stages. To say that you've learned from a crisis means 3 things. The lowest level of learning is that you believe new things. There's been a cognitive shift in how you see the world. That's the first phase of learning. The second phase of learning is that cognitive shift then turns into individual behavioral changes. Not only do we believe something new, but that's causing our behavior to change. And then the final stage is what's called institutionalization. So it's the behavioral changes within an organization are collectivized and are institutionalized into new policies and procedures that just become part of practice. So if you think about policing, the crisis in policing in Black communities in America now, we're at that, we're not through the crisis, but when you think about the learning phase, it really will be tested based on those things. Are we seeing policing in new ways? And I think you can argue that there's already signs that we're beginning to, broader segments of the population in the United States are beginning to understand and view policing, particularly in Black communities, in new ways. Does that result in new behaviors of how people are interacting? And will it be institutionalized so that things like what happened in Minneapolis can't ever happen again because of new policies or procedures, accountability? So that's the hardest and final stage. So we might have some time for questions at the end, but that kind of ends my little bit on trying to connect your experience to crises. And I'm going to turn things over to Sora with the next slide now.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much. So just to continue that segue, Bruce has given us a framework for thinking about what you have recently experienced, or for volunteers who returned prior to the past 2 months, what you experienced during your service, whenever it was. The last part of this morning's program is really to give you another framework for thinking about where you can go from here and what comes next. So very quickly, here's a review of what I'm going to be talking about, giving you some ideas about thinking about what happened, planning for what comes next, talking about different options and strategies for achieving them. We'll talk about graduate school specifically, and if you have any questions about professional development and career planning, we can go there as well. So I want to encourage everybody that after the session ends, Bruce has given us so much to think about. I want to actually ask you to take some time and think about 2 questions. And the first question is, using the frameworks that Bruce introduced, how would you describe your Peace Corps experience to others? And especially if you're thinking about graduate school, or you're starting to apply for jobs and think about what comes next in terms of professional development. It's one thing to say, oh, I was an evacuated Peace Corps volunteer. And then depending on the tone of your voice, the person talking with you is going to say, oh, that's too bad that you got evacuated. And then it moves on. But if you can think of some ways to highlight skills, learnings that you're taking away from that situation, then it opens up a conversation that you can have that becomes deeper and more personal. As you then change your perspective and start to look forward, ask yourself, where do you want to be in 2 years? What do you want to be doing in 2 years? And really, the time that you use to frame this question and your response to it will vary from person to person. Some of you, it might be a question, what do I want to be doing come September, and 4 months from now? But thinking a little bit longer term, where do you want to be in 2 years? Where do you want to be in 5 years? And by where, I don't mean geographically as much as I mean in terms of your life experiences. What do you want to be doing? That can help you think about what you should be doing in the shorter term. So if you can lay out some longer term visions, then it gives you a destination to shoot for as you think about shorter term actions. Now, when I'm coaching people through development of a career vision statement, I want to point out, I think about this the way I think about travel. When I'm traveling, I love to plan in advance, and I read about where I'm going, I read about what's available there, what the options for activities are, how to get to know local culture, how to immerse myself, language learning, but I'm always ready to shift because things come up that I didn't know about or that I didn't expect. Career planning is very similar. It's good to give yourself a vision of a destination, but you're not creating a career planning contract. It's really a career plan because things are going to happen along the way. Whether that means you find out about a job that you didn't anticipate and you realize you really want to apply for it. Maybe you meet a partner and all of a sudden you realize this person could be a potential life partner. Maybe someone in your family gets ill and you need to take a break to take care of them. Maybe you decide to move to a new place and that wasn't part of the plan originally. All of those, life just happens. All of those are good reasons for changing your plan. But we find that if people don't have some sort of a plan in mind, the voyage, the journey can be much more haphazard. Maybe you get to someplace valuable, maybe you end up someplace else. Of course, all of life is valuable, but I think you get my point. So think about what's feasible for you. Do you want to have an idea of 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 to 10 years from now? That part's up to you. But I encourage you to take some time and write a paragraph or two. Where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? What skills would be useful for doing that? What kinds of responsibilities might you like to have? Next slide, please. Thank you. So as you're thinking about that, that career plan, here are 3 things that you can do now to help you develop it and to help make it even more concrete. First is to look at job postings that are on the NPCA websites of professional associations, looking at organizations, for example, like Interaction, which is the trade association, if you will, for international development. On their membership page, they have links to over 200 development organizations, and all of those have employment pages with job openings. If you're interested in international education, you might look at the job postings that are posted to NAFSA, Association of International Educators. If you know that you want to be in a specific place, the newspapers for that location, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, whatever the local paper is, still has job postings on their websites, even if they're not in the physical paper now. Idealist.org is a great website for looking at jobs related to social change and social action. There are many more. I note here to look at many job postings because the idea is that you're not looking for jobs that you want to apply for just yet. You're trying to read as many postings as possible to, in a professional development journal, make a list of responsibilities that jobs are asking for, minimum and preferred qualifications that jobs are asking for, terminology and jargon that appears. Only by looking at 20, 30, 40, or even 50 job postings will you get a sense of the trends, of what's being looked for, of the terminology being used. Also, what's going to happen by looking at that many job postings is that some of them are going to start to make your heart sing. And you want to bookmark those. You want to print them out and keep them in a special file. Because the fact that when you read them, you start to feel all tingly, and as I said, your heart starts to sing, tells you that that's a position that you might be interested in pursuing later on. I encourage you, if you are thinking about job search and you start to apply for jobs, apply broadly, apply for as many as you possibly can. The worst that happens is that you get an interview. The worst that happens is that you get practice talking about your recent experiences and your professional skills and your professional goals. That way you're gaining experience so that when you have the one job interview for the one job that is, the one you want more than anything in the world, you'll have had good practice beforehand. That won't be the first time you're being asked to talk about the evacuation and how it affected your life, or the work that you were doing at your Peace Corps site, or your academic training. The more practice you get with that process, the better. So that's the first thing you can do, is look at job postings. Next, conduct informational interviews. And an informational interview is different than a job interview because the one thing you are not doing is asking about job possibilities at that organization. Identify organizations that you might be interested in working within, or that do work that you're not yet familiar with, just to fill in the gaps of your knowledge. Find somebody on their website who seems to have a job title or a job description that is of interest for you, and reach out to them. Perhaps you're connecting through a Peace Corps network as well. Perhaps there is somebody who is an alum of your undergraduate program or undergraduate institution, or perhaps they just happen to be at an organization or in a community where you might be interested in working. The thing about informational interviews is that there are several things you can do to really maximize their impact. Ask for 30 minutes of someone's time. If you ask for an hour, given how busy people are on Zoom with meetings right now, they might say, I don't have an hour to talk to somebody I don't even know. But 30 minutes is a lot easier for people to commit to. However, be prepared for the interview to go longer than 30 minutes, because what often happens is that once people start talking, they don't stop. People love to talk about themselves and their work. So you want to go into the interview with 5 or 6 key questions, very open-ended questions. Tell me about your background. How did you get to where you are now? What kind of work are you doing? What are the trends and challenges that your institution is facing? And you can qualify that and ask them to think about pre-COVID times so that you're not getting the same answer over and over again. Oh, we're challenged by COVID. Oh, we're challenged by nobody knowing when the world is going to open. If you ask them to think about pre-pandemic activities, you'll get a deeper understanding of the work that the organization was doing, of the trends and challenges that they were facing before COVID became part of the reality. We're aware of what COVID is doing right now. Your goal is to understand the core mission of the institution and how they work toward accomplishing that. A last question that works well is, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you were looking for this position or when you were starting in your career? It encourages people to reflect and often allows them to come up with 1 or 2 golden nuggets of job advice and career development advice. After the informational interview, be sure and send a thank you note. More and more email thank you notes are welcome. If it's an organization that you realize you would be very much interested in working with, there is nothing as powerful as a handwritten thank you note. It shows the individual that you took the time to think about what you're saying, to honor the time commitment that they made in talking with you, and allows for continued conversation and connection. Now, when you're asking for the informational interview, as I said earlier, you're not asking about job openings. You're really taking a very low profile approach to this. They know that you're asking because you're interested in learning about possible jobs, but you don't need to bring that to the forefront of the conversation. You don't want to include your resume as you're asking for the informational interview, because then it becomes a little more passive aggressive. It seems more passive aggressive. What you can do is, when you're sending a thank you note, if it is an institution that you think could be a good fit for you, at that time, you can include your resume and note that you're attaching it in case there's an opening that they think might be a good fit for you. And that's all that you're going to do. Again, the idea is to really be asking for information, keep it broad, have them talk about themselves, their backgrounds, their organizations, and once you've conducted 10 or 15 or 20 informational interviews, again, you're going to start to see trends in the field. You're going to get a sense of what might be of interest to you and a sense of what's not of interest to you. So you're using these strategies to test some assumptions and to test your growing knowledge of the fields within which you might be working. The last thing that you can do right now is draft your resume, and I should say draft your resumes, have several different versions handy, have them clearly labeled. This one is for working with international development organizations that are multi-sector. This one is for organizations that work specifically with community development, while this one is specifically focused on gender issues and gender development. And within each of those, you're highlighting, of course, the skills, the knowledge, the background that you have related to those particular sectors, and then the other sectors are going to come later on in the resume. Draft some accompanying cover letters so that you have a template to work with once you start applying for jobs. And again, have a draft related to each of the different sectors that you might be interested in working in. Drafting your resume now, asking people to provide very clear, critical feedback on it will again help you to really hone in on what's of interest to you and help you be able to articulate and answer more clearly questions about what you did during the Peace Corps and before that, how you're processing the evacuation, and what your goals are for the future. So thinking about job search is one thing that you might be interested in now. Next slide, please. We're assuming that you also might be interested in graduate school for those of you who don't have a master's degree, or perhaps you're even thinking about a doctorate at some time as well. Thinking about graduate school can be a very deliberate process, and I wanted to share some of the criteria that you can use to help track graduate schools that might be of interest. I am going to talk about SIT in more detail as well, but we know SIT isn't a fit for everybody, and we want this to be of value to you, even if SIT is not going to be a good fit for you. I'll come back and talk about why it might be a good fit in a moment, but here are some general criteria that you can use when you're looking at different graduate programs. What are the subject areas that you are interested in studying, and what are the subject areas that each graduate school or graduate program looks at? How does it structure them in terms of majors? And usually at the graduate level, programs talk about concentrations as opposed to minors. So you want to see if there are programs in which you are majoring in your primary area of interest, or perhaps the program is broader, but allows you to create a concentration in your area of interest. Because each of these considerations can be of different importance for each of you. Sometimes the subject area might play a lesser role, but the location might be a larger role. So for example, maybe it's important to you to be in a certain geographic area because of family ties. There's a graduate program that's not exactly what you wanted to study. The question to ask is it close enough? And through some of the other criteria, do you have other opportunities to study what you might be interested in? So location, how important is that for you? How closely tied are you to a certain geographic area? What's the cost of the program? And of course, part of cost is asking what are their financial aid options? What are the factors that they're considering when they are making financial aid awards? Is it only US federal financial aid that's taken into account? In which case you need to either be a green card holder or a US citizen. Many schools have scholarships that are not tied to passport, that are instead tied to merit or areas of interest. And of course, there is a lovely, rich network of schools that provide scholarships for returned Peace Corps volunteers, a great place to start. Make sure that your graduate program is accredited either through one of the regional accreditation associations or through a content-focused accreditation agency. Look at the admissions criteria to make sure that you are in the ballpark in terms of what they're looking for. But even if you feel like you don't meet all of the admissions criteria head on, if you're interested in the program, it's still worth having a conversation with their admissions counselors, because sometimes there's something in your background that makes you even more attractive to the program. And even if your GPA, for example, is a little bit lower than they would like, the fact that you're a returned Peace Corps volunteer who speaks articulately about living in a different kind of community, about having been evacuated, that then gets you to the top of the pile. What's the curriculum of the specific program, and what is the pedagogy that's used within that curriculum? Is it a more traditional lecture-based program? Are there opportunities for internships or co-ops, either within a course? Is an internship required for graduation? Is the program based on a different kind of pedagogy? For example, SIT uses 2 different learning philosophies that set us apart from some of the other programs. Specifically, all of our programs involve theories of adult learning and experiential learning theories. And I'll come back and talk about those in a bit more detail. What are the institutional values? What is the institution trying to accomplish? And is that a good fit for you? What are the academic requirements for graduation, not just for admissions, but for graduation? Is a certain GPA required? Is there a work requirement? How many courses are required? And what's the expected timeline? How does that fit in with your own personal needs? Does the program require a culminating project, a master's thesis, a research project, a capstone project or paper of some sort? And how will that help further your professional development and your learning? What kind of leeway do they allow in the development and in the structure of that project? What kinds of co-curricular services does the program and the school offer? If you have documented learning challenges, or you suspect you might, what kinds of services do they offer for students with learning disabilities? By law, they should be offering a certain level. Make sure that what they offer allows you to accomplish your learning in a way that works for you. Do they offer on-campus facilities if you're planning on moving to be closer to the campus? For some people, maybe the attending a large university that has athletic, grand athletic opportunities in terms of a gym for students and classes within the gym, maybe having lots of public spaces, maybe having lots of speaker series. What kinds of extracurricular programs are involved? At SIT, we were and are known for having intellectually grounded co-curricular services. If a student really needed a gym, coming to our campus wouldn't be necessarily a good fit for them because our physical resources are a lot smaller than a lot of larger universities. So all of that is gonna come together as an equation, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. The final total is it a personal fit for you? Is this program helping you to get to where you want to be? I encourage you, as you look at different schools, if you're just starting that process, to create a notebook and make sure that you bookmark the websites of various programs and schools that you're looking at, and keep notes about all of these, because they very quickly start to blend together. So the more notes you take in advance, the easier it is to then go back and refer back to them later on. Next slide. So those are some frameworks for general career development, career job search, and thinking about graduate school. We wanted to share, of course, SIT is a great option, and a lot of Return Peace Corps volunteers find that SIT works well for them. Part of this is because of the history of SIT. Pardon me for one moment. I will share that SIT was originally founded as the Experiment in International Living in 1932. It was founded as a youth exchange program. After World War I, several youth exchange programs were founded because people were thinking, how do we prevent war from happening? How do we get people to understand how other people live? Well, we do that by having people live together. And clearly, young people with open minds that are still growing and flexible and melding are just hotbeds of intercultural learning, if you will. So the experiment was created as a high school exchange program. One of the early experimenters was a fellow named Sergeant Shriver. So in 1961, when President Kennedy created the Peace Corps, he was talking with people in his inner circle. He was reminded that Sergeant Shriver had been on this exchange program, and Shriver shared that he had a very extensive intercultural training orientation when he was getting ready to go away on the experiment. So when he was asked by President Kennedy to be the first director of the Peace Corps, he went to the experiment and asked if they could adjust the cross-cultural training to work with Peace Corps volunteers and provide training for them. And that was the birth of the School for International Training. We were officially founded as a school in 1964. And in the early years in the 1960s, all Peace Corps trainees came up to our campus in Vermont, first in Putney, Vermont, and then in Brattleboro, where the school is currently located. And everybody came and spent several weeks learning about culture, going through preliminary language training, and then they would travel from Vermont to their country sites. In 1974, the school developed its curriculum even further so that it wasn't just pre-departure intercultural training and language training. The programs offered by SIT have been many over the years. I will note we are accredited by the New England Commission on Higher Education, so that question about accreditation, check. And in the next slides, I'll share a little bit of more information about the programs that we're offering currently. You can see if there's something that might be of interest for you. As we look at the programs that SIT offers, you'll see that all of them connect with one or two or more of what we refer to as critical global issues. About a year and a half ago, the entire SIT and our NGO sibling, World Learning, all of the staff and faculty were asked to step back and think about the work that we do at the highest levels. What were the global issues that we were trying to work on? What were the problems in the world that we were trying to solve? And after months and months of discussion and reflection and conversation, we came up with these 7 critical global issues. We find that it helps people who are new to our organization to get a sense of what we do. So whether you're looking at the programs that are development and exchange programs managed through our nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., if you're looking at our undergraduate study abroad programs, at our undergraduate online learning programs, and at our graduate programs, you'll find that every program connects back to one or more of these critical global issues. Next slide. I'm going to introduce specifically the graduate programs, our master's degrees, in 2 groups. The first group are our low residency programs, and we refer to them as hybrid because when we're not dealing with a global pandemic, all of these programs involve short-term residencies on our Vermont campus. And I'll note there was a photograph early on in Bruce's presentation that showed you a room. It was a dining hall with a high ceiling and the windows overlooked the view. This is sitting just outside of that room on the terrace outside of our dining hall. And that is the view of the Connecticut River Valley that our students are able to enjoy during their on-campus residencies. The low residency programs that we offer share several things in common. They are part-time programs. The majority of students in our low residency programs are working or working professionally, or some of them are working raising families. So they're not able to leave their home communities to study full-time. The programs are primarily online, but each program does involve between 1 and 2 or 3 residencies, usually on our Vermont campus, with some additional options available. The programs all take on average 23 months to complete, and we've designed them so that a student can complete their master's degree within 24 months, within 2 years. The residencies, when we are not dealing with a global pandemic, happen during the first semester of study. The programs begin online with a few weeks of engagement for students to get to know their cohort mates and to get to know the curriculum. Students then come to campus for a 2-week intensive seminar. You're working constantly during that 2 weeks. Like I said, it's very intense. We tell students who are working to make sure they are taking time away from work, because you're not able to do your work while you're in session during that 2-week period. Students then return home and continue their coursework online for a year. Most of the programs involve a second residency. It may involve returning to Brattleboro, but some of our programs' second residencies take place outside of Brattleboro. Our Sustainable Development Program this past year took a group of students to Oaxaca, Mexico for 2 weeks. The Peace and Justice Leadership Program will take a group of students to Cape Town, South Africa for 2 weeks this coming fall. I want to note that the details around the residencies change from year to year. The program structure is shifting a little bit as well, and a lot of that is because of the global pandemic. Students who just started the program this past summer weren't able to come to campus for obvious reasons. So we're reworking the timing of their residencies in the hopes that within the next 12 months, we will be able to meet face-to-face for a 2-week period somewhere in the world. All of the program course requirements are asynchronous. So while each program might have weekly requirements, or you know that a term paper is due by week 9 and your presentation that you're pre-taping with a voice over PowerPoint is due in week 11, the professors will give you weekly or bi-weekly markers that you need to achieve, but when you do your work day by day and week by week is up to you. Our students are located all over the world. It's always 3 a.m. someplace. So we have no synchronous requirements, and we do offer some optional synchronous conversations with faculty. We crave, as much as our students crave, face-to-face live interaction. But again, they're not required. So people don't need to worry about having to be online for class at 3 in the morning. All of our programs have some kind of culminating project for students in our International Education Master's degree. Because it is focused on education, it is a more extensive research or capstone paper. For students in other degrees, the culminating project might relate back to a project they did earlier in the program. The options are to come to a face-to-face seminar or to present your final project virtually as well. Next slide, and I'll talk about the global master's models, and we'll leave a few minutes for questions as well. The global master's model is full-time. The degrees vary from 12 to 16 months. So this is a great program for somebody who wants to immerse themselves in local cultures, spending 1 semester in culture A, a 2nd semester in culture B, and then doing a practicum and capstone final project in a location of their choice. All of the options vary from program to program, and you can find out where they are located by looking at our website. The Global Masters in Development Practice has semesters in Ecuador and Malawi. The Global Masters in Diplomacy has a semester in South Africa, and travel to Switzerland. Bruce can correct me if I'm wrong. The International Education Global Masters has semesters in Vietnam and Chile, just to give you a sample of the diversity. All of the programs involve field-based learning and research, a variety of field trips to organizations that are doing what you're learning in classes, Every program, every semester involves an excursion so that you have some kind of point of comparison. If you're based in a capital city, you might travel to a rural area to look at that topic, that issue in a different scenario. And again, all of them have some kind of culminating seminar. Next slide, please. So here are a list of the different areas, the different degrees that SIT offers. I won't read through them. You can do that just fine. If you have questions, we're gonna open it up for questions now, and you can ask about the specific degrees that you might be interested in. Oh, sorry, there we go. Quickly, admissions criteria. I'd rather open it up for questions. So I'll close there and turn things back to Megan and to Jody.
Great, thank you, Sora, and thank you, Bruce and Joe. We will just open it up to questions now. I did just want to end with this slide in case any of you on the call are interested in diving a little bit deeper into processing your personal and professional story with SIT. Joe, who started off the conversation today, will be presenting on this topic next Thursday at 12 o'clock Eastern. But we do have just about 2 minutes, so if anyone has any burning questions or wants to ask anything to any of the presenters, please feel free to use the chat function, or we can unmute you as well, and we can do it that way. So it looks like there is a question that came in. I'd like to talk more about the international education, maybe on a one-on-one basis. What's the best way to go about that? And looks like Sora answered.
I just shared my email address, so anybody is welcome to reach out to all of us, and we're happy to follow up.
Great. For anyone who's not able to see the chat function, just so everyone was aware of what the question was, there were a few people that had asked if they could talk to someone regarding the International Education Program. And Sora has provided her email in the chat box, as well as it can be found on the screen as well in front of you on the PowerPoint. And maybe just with the last minute, if any of the presenters have any final words or words of wisdom or anything, please feel free to share now. Otherwise, I just want to be conscious of the 2 hours.
I'll just share. I think Sora's going to join me as well for the next webinar that we're offering. So we look forward to maybe seeing some of you again. I hope today was useful. I just as an RPCV, like I feel for the experience you all are going through, and I know folks were, evacuated at different times. For those who were evacuated, and different levels of relationships that had developed, and just know there's a community of folks who want to listen to your story and want to help you, shape the next chapter of it. So I really appreciate this time to share with you.
That's wonderful, and thank you, Joe, and everyone else, Bruce, and the entire team at SAT. This was really informative. I enjoyed learning more about it myself, the concept, and it was just very, very helpful. And I'm sure it's nice of you to share your email so that folks can reach out to you and connect with you directly, and that will help folks that listen to the recording as well. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you to all the participants, and thank you to you, Jody, and NPCA for this opportunity.
No problem. It is our pleasure. Absolutely happy to kind of just be in the background here and help with that, and you all did great. There was, I noticed, one other question that did come in from Crystal that says, if you have one more minute maybe, can we look at the admission requirements? Was that the page? There was a page, maybe admission criteria. Yep. So she wanted to see that. So great. And I'm sure any of them would be happy to talk to you one-on-one about any specific questions that you have. If you have them as a follow-up, or if you have additional ones right now, you could unmute yourself. You have that option and ask the question now. And then we'll wrap up after this question so that we stay within that pretty much 2-hour limit for everyone who's collaborating on this. So.
Thanks to our friends at SIT from NPCA. Great job.
Yes, it was wonderful. Thanks so much. So I'll go ahead and end the session then now. And thank you again.
One moment,
yes.
please. Sorry. So I actually have one question. So if
Great.
I'm applying for the program, will I need to also have letters of recommendations as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there are, as part of the application, it'll be an online application that you'll fill out. And one of those requirements will be letters of recommendation. And our admissions counselor, our counselors, I should say, are Mary Kay Sigda and Myra Tungatarova, and they will help guide you through that process. But the letters of recommendation should be coming from both a professional who knows you in a professional setting, as well as someone that knows you in an academic setting. So we ask for kind of two different recommenders that can give that perspective of how you perform in an academic setting as well as in a professional
Okay,
setting.
perfect. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I saw a question come through about the doctoral programs. We do have one webinar that the final webinar that we're hosting for the month of June. That'll be next week. And I'm blanking, I apologize on the date and time, but if you email me, I'll pull up our emails here. I would be happy to send you all those details for registering for that.
And that's a webinar specifically about the doctoral program, not to be confused with the second Peace Corps webinar.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
And all of the information is on our website too.
Exactly. Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you everyone again for participating, for all of your work that you put into this great presentation. We look forward to our next week one, as was already mentioned. And I'm going to sign off then now and end the meeting for everyone, okay?
All right. Thank you, Jody.
Thanks,
No
everyone.
problem. No problem. I'm just going to stop the recording and end it. All right.